Ypres, a market town in Flanders. A beleaguered fortress guarding the last free corner of Belgian soil. Ypres to the British Army, or Ypres. Wipers to the newspapers and the upper classes. The British first came to Ypres in October 1914.
We pass over the moat through Vauban's 17th century ramparts by the Lille Gate. The large cobbled square is full of British and Belgian troops. We pay a too brief visit to the wonderful Flemish Cloth Hall and St. Martin's Church. It's a gem of a town with its lovely old-world gabled houses, red-tiled roofs, and no factories visible to spoil the charm.
The first Battle of Ypres in 1914 began to demolish the charm. In 1915, still heavier bombardments beat upon the ancient town. This was the second battle. Ypres crumbled steadily, but held out. Through it lay all communication to the salient. The salient was a vast British slaughterhouse. Everywhere, the Germans looked down on the British positions from the so-called ridges. It was in the salient in April 1915 that the Germans first used the new weapon of gas.
I don't mind admitting that I didn't think much of the urinating on the handkerchief. I didn't think it was sufficient protection. So I went into one of the trench latrines, you know, just a bucket stuck in a hole, and I stuck my head in the bucket. I made sure of it.
And in the salient at Hooge, 2 months later, the British first encountered the horror of flamethrowers.
The first idea sort of flitted through my mind was that the end of the world had come, and this was the day of judgment. Because suddenly the whole dawn had turned ghastly crimson.
All through 1916, the outline of the salient barely altered. 100 yards here, a quarter of a mile there, fruits of what was called the crater fighting. Scraps of ground were captured, lost, recaptured, at a cost never measured against real gain. In the salient, the guns were never silent. Labor was unending. Death and pain were always present. By 1917, the whole area had become an immense, disgusting sty, a ravaged vista of splintered trees, wrecked farms, and craters which quickly filled with water. In this low country, drainage was all important. But years of shelling had burst the drains and broken the banks of the streams which flowed through the salient. Rough plank roads and treacherous duckboard tracks zigzagged through the miles. All supplies had to be carried along them, mostly by night. All of them, day and night, were death traps. To the British Army, Ypres had become what Verdun became to the French, a symbol of absolute determination, of fatal endurance. By the summer of 1917, General Robert Nivelle's offensive on the Aisne had collapsed, and the French army had collapsed with it. Russia, swept by revolution in March, was now an unknown quantity. As Britain's Prime Minister, Mr. Lloyd George, said,
"The British Army was the one Allied army in the field which could be absolutely relied on for any enterprise."
Upon this army now fell the burden of the war. Not until June was the first stroke ready, under General Plumer, veteran commander of the British Second Army. And now, one of the war's most deadly methods reached its climax, the underground war. The war of mines and tunnels, groping beneath no man's land towards the enemy lines, in which men dug and crouched and fought and blew each other to pieces.
The essence of mining in the clay area was silence and secrecy. We wore felt slippers, rubber-wheeled trolleys, wooden rails, and we spoke in whispers. And when the German blew us, we never answered back. We suffered casualties and said nothing. Try not to give away where we were.
Under the Messines Ridge, which shut in the southern side of the Ypres salient, the British had driven 19 deep mine tunnels containing nearly 1 million pounds of high explosive. Some of these mines had been begun as far back as 1915. By 1916, some 20,000 British, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand soldiers, and about as many Germans, were tunneling towards each other. The date was June the 7th. The time was 3:10 a.m. Nightingales were singing in the woods.
Then suddenly the whole earth heaved, and up from the ground came what really looked more like two enormous cypress trees, the silhouettes of great dark cone-shaped lifts of earth up to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet. And we watched this, and then a moment later, of course, we struck the repercussion wave of the blast, and it flung us right away backwards.
The whole hillside, everything rocked like a ship at sea. The noise from the artillery was deafening. The thunder from our charges was enormous. The infantry dashed forward under a barrage and went forward and kept sending back thousands and thousands of prisoners.
Over 7,000 German prisoners were taken at Messines. Men shaken and unnerved by the huge explosions which had swallowed up many of their comrades. In one concrete shelter, 4 German officers were found sitting round a table, killed by shock. For miles around, it seemed like an earthquake. It was distinctly felt in London. General Plumer's Second Army had won a clear-cut victory. In April, Vimy. In June, Messines. The 2 strongest bastions of the German front had been stormed by the British Army. All the omens seemed favorable for the great offensive. Breaking out of the salient seemed to be only a matter of time and preparation. The army trained and labored at the massive build-up required for a set-piece battle in 1917. They were in good heart. They did not know that ugly clouds were gathering about their enterprise. On June the 19th, Haig was summoned to London to discuss the campaign with the cabinet. The meetings were charged with ill feeling. Distrust between the nation's political leaders and its generals had never been higher.
When Sir Douglas Haig explained his projects to the civilians, he spread on the table a large map and made dramatic use of both his hands to demonstrate how he proposed to sweep up the enemy. First the right hand brushed along the surface irresistibly, then came the left, the outer finger ultimately touching the German frontier with a nail across. It is not surprising that some of our number were so captivated by the splendor of the landscape opened out to our vision that their critical faculties were overwhelmed.
Lloyd George remained skeptical, but there was a shock in store for him.
A most serious and startling situation was disclosed today. At today's conference, Admiral Jellicoe, as First Sea Lord, stated that owing to the great shortage of shipping due to the German submarines, it would be impossible for Great Britain to continue the war in 1918. This was a bombshell for the cabinet and all present.
Jellicoe insisted that Zeebrugge must be cleared of U-boats. Lloyd George was in a dilemma.
It was decided that I should once more sum up the misgivings which most of us felt, and that the responsibility for decision should be left to Sir William Robertson and Sir Douglas Haig.
Reluctantly, the government gave its authority to the Flanders offensive on the advice of the naval and army leaders. Now the time for talking was drawing to an end. On June the 21st, one of Haig's staff officers wrote,
"The longest day of the year, and we have not yet begun the really big effort. We fight alone here, the only army active. We shall do well, of that there is no reasonable doubt. Have we the time to accomplish?"
Time was inexorably passing. Time while the staffs worked out their detailed plans. Time while roads were laid, mended, relaid and remended. Time while new divisions, including a whole French army, poured into the salient. Time while training received its finishing touches. As each day passed, the signs of coming battle multiplied. Veterans knew now how to interpret them.
Until yesterday, most of those addressing us with a comprehensive sweep of the pointer across the map have declared that by 0 hour, all the German trenches will be obliterated by our shells. A tale we've heard before. The last lecturer, however, ominously omitted to provide this comforting assurance.
The men of 1917 were less easily deluded, less trustful than earlier generations of the war. Too many things had gone wrong.
Good morning, the General said when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and were cursing his staff for incompetent swine. "He's a cheery old card," grunted Harry to Jack as they slugged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both by his plan of attack.
The last days of July were running out. A certain uneasiness made itself felt, in the line and behind it. A staff officer wrote,
"My one fear is the weather. I do not think that we can hope for more than a fortnight's, or at best 3 weeks of really fine weather."
Through the stinking, smoking ruins of Ypres and the shattered villages around it, the troops marched to their positions. Because soldiers liked to sing, and because they were still a long way from the end of hope, they marched in singing. But the songs were changing. The sardonic note was more emphatic now.
The entire Ypres salient, to a depth of some 8 miles from the front line, is alive with infantry, artillery, repair workshops, hospitals and ambulances of Gough's Fifth Army in billet, bivouac, mottle-painted tent or hut. The sheds and yards of buildings, copses and all other cover hide tanks, long-range guns, heavy howitzers and ammunition. Tonight we must bivouac. And there seems to be scarcely a bit of vacant ground the size of a football pitch clear of troops, gear, and stores.
Halted against the shade of a last hill, they fed, and lying easy, were at ease, and finding comfortable chests and knees, carelessly slept. But many there stood still to face the stark blank sky beyond the ridge, knowing their feet had come to the end of the world.
Final decisions, final preparations.
I've ordered the provost sergeant with the battalion police to line up in the front trench as soon as the assault starts. They're to arrest any men who return improperly. Although I command a battalion whose courage and loyalty have never given me a trace of anxiety, one must guard against those inexplicable panics which may seize brave men and which are so infectious.
This, by now, was an army of veterans. The men of 1917 were warier, more skillful, but they were less hasty to sacrifice themselves. The war itself was an older and uglier beast. Edmund Blunden wrote,
"There were opportunities enough for death or glory, but the experienced sense observed that people did not espouse them with the comparatively bright eye of a year before. 1917 was distasteful."
0 hour was 3:50 a.m. on July the 31st. 9 divisions of the Fifth Army, 5 divisions of the Second Army, and 2 French divisions went over the top. This was the British Army's largest single effort since the Somme, 13 months before. But this was no Somme catastrophe. Yet this was no victory either. This was not a Vimy or a Messines. It was that most delusive of war's products, a half success or half failure. Straight away, 2 persistent features of this battle were seen. Early in the afternoon, rain began to fall. Soon it turned into a drenching torrent. And shortly after the rain began, the German counterattack started to come in. Up to their knees in mud, with rifles and light machine guns choked by it, inch by inch, the German infantry began to wrest back the British morning gains. To that extent, this was another Somme. With this difference, the rain did not cease. Every attack was drowned. The British were bogged. The August weather washed their hopes away. The battlefield turned into a swamp. The miseries of war multiplied and heaped upon the soldiers.
It rained absolutely continuously. One was as afraid of getting drowned as one was of getting hit by shells.
There was no chance of getting wounded and getting a blighty one at Passchendaele. You'd either get through or die, because if you're wounded and you slip off the duck boards, you just sank into the mud.
The mud was so deep that with drag ropes on the wheels and something like 100 men on the drag ropes, it was impossible to pull the guns out of the mud. You see fellows coming down there from the trenches badly wounded, covered from head to foot in blood, perhaps an arm missing. You see some of the fellows drop off the duck board and literally die from exhaustion, from loss of blood. Horrible it was.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, blood-shod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys. An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning.
The barrage roars and lifts, then clumsily bowed with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear. Men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces masked with fear, they leave their trenches going over the top while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists. And hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. Oh, Jesu, make it stop.
The weather cleared. The ground began to dry.
Our artillery barrage was magnificent, quite the best that the Australians had ever seen. Creeping forward exactly according to plan, the barrage won the ground while the infantry followed behind and occupied all the important points with a minimum of resistance.
This seemed to be a turning point at last. The German Army Group commander wrote,
"It is to be hoped that another attack will not follow too quickly, as we have not sufficient reserves behind the front."
An officer on Haig's staff was writing,
"It is